Welcome back. It's Monday, July 31st. Thanks a lot for being with us here on Indiana Sports Beat Radio. Joined now by Mitt Winter from Kenny Hertz Perry LLC, sports attorney dealing with NIL and lots of other things. But NIL has had to be a boon for you, Mitt.
Yeah. I was working in college sports on the legal side before NIL, was allowed for college athletes. But since, over the past 2 years and change, the NIL related work has definitely increased a lot. And so doing a lot of different things in that world, and I really enjoy it. Background as a former college basketball player and already having worked in the space. It's a lot of fun to kind of work in this new industry where things are changing all the time. Keep you on your toes.
Yeah, a former basketball player at William and Mary, that has to make a huge difference for if I was it doesn't matter what the case may be, but in this case, it's an athlete. If I was an athlete looking for an attorney, I would definitely prefer one that had actually participated in what I'm doing and would have a much better feeling of what they have gone through.
Yeah, it definitely helps with, give you a better understanding of just kind of what's going on behind the scenes at a school or with the NCAA or whatever it might be. You kind of know, what people are going through on a day-to-day basis, which definitely gives you some insight that someone who wasn't a former college athlete might not have. So I definitely think it's helpful.
And the next step for these athletes after NIL, first of all, it just seems inevitable. It's going to have some congressional intervention because the states are kind of screwing this up, in my opinion. When you have a state like Missouri who enacts a law that is exactly opposite of what the NCAA says you can do, that's kind of ridiculous, in my opinion, for them to do that. But anyway, you're looking at potentially having 50 different sets of laws for states.
Yeah, I mean, right now there are 7 different federal bills that have been drafted or introduced this session. I'm not confident that any of them are going to pass. Number one, I don't think any of them will generate enough bipartisan support to get the votes they need. And then number two, when you have 7 bills out there, it just kind of divides everyone's attention on the issue. And I don't think anyone's going to be able to coalesce around one of these bills. And just kind of on the topic more broadly, I'm not necessarily in favor of a federal bill that just talks about, limiting the rights of college athletes to monetize their NILs. I think there are better ways to address it, whether that's through the NCAA or trying to reach some sort of agreement with the athletes, whatever it may be. But either way, I don't think we're going to see a federal bill this year. And if it doesn't happen this year, it kind of remains to be seen what the NCAA and the conferences who are kind of the ones pushing for a federal bill will do after that. There's been talk. There were some recent meetings actually out in Indianapolis last week, and they're supposed to meet again this week, kind of talking about, what's going to be our plan B for NIL if we can't get a federal bill passed. And so we'll kind of see what comes out of that.
Like I mentioned Missouri, and the reason I mentioned it is they passed a law that allows coaches to participate in these deals for the athletes where the NCAA does not allow that to take place. How is that going to be rectified in the interim?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a question of whether the NCAA is going to try and challenge some of these state laws or just kind of let the states do their thing until either a federal bill is passed or something else happens. But I personally don't think the NCAA is going to go to any of these states and try and challenge these state laws. That could be some messy litigation for them. And it's similar to what happened 2 years ago when states started passing laws that said the NCAA can't enforce its NIL rules, and athletes in those states have to be able to monetize their NIL in general. The NCAA could have challenged some of those laws, but it decided, well, we're not going to challenge those laws. We're just going to change our rules. It's a little bit different here because some of these state laws are saying NCAA, you can't come in and enforce your rules in our state. But I just don't see the NCAA going in and challenging one of these states that has, varying laws that kind of contradict some of the NCAA stuff.
No, the modus operandi has generally been to either not allow that state to host NCAA championships, so no school that was in there could host an NCAA event, or the possibility of banning schools from those states that do that from NCAA events.
Both of those things are possible. I think they're probably pretty unlikely as well, because these state laws, they say this NCAA cannot, punish or penalize schools in any way for participating in activities allowed under these state laws. So again, if the NCAA does try and penalize a school for doing something allowed under its state law, I think pretty quickly we'll have some litigation that would happen. I could see a state attorney general suing the NCAA in a situation like that. And I don't know if you guys paid attention at all to what happened with Tennessee recently when they were penalized by the NCAA. But the NCAA was considering, a postseason bowl ban for the football team. And before the NCAA was able to come out with their penalties for Tennessee's attorney general sent a letter to the NCAA saying, we have a state law that says you cannot interfere with college athletes' rights to monetize their NIL in any way. And if you give the football team a bowl ban, you're going to be violating that law. So think about that before you penalize the football team. And who knows whether that had any effect on the penalty that the NCAA gave to Tennessee football, but they didn't end up giving them a postseason bowl ban. They gave them a pretty hefty fine instead.
Yeah, and that also makes you wonder, as has always been the case, how sharp are the teeth of the NCAA? They seem to have been dulled even more so now than what they were before.
Yeah, that's true. And especially as I think we'll see more states pass laws similar to the ones that have been passed in Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, New York now. And as that continues on, is that going to weaken the NCAA even more and kind of dull the teeth that they, do still have? So it's kind of putting the NCAA in a hard situation. Are they going to let states continue to pass these laws that kind of weaken their authority, or at some point are they going to say, well, we're to that point where we have to, try and penalize one of these schools, no matter what's going to happen, if they're going to sue us or not, just because if we don't, then, we're becoming more irrelevant by the day.
What's next with NIL? I mean, we've seen some complaints from coaches, and it cracks me up. It's the coaches are complaining from the SEC, and I'm kind of laugh because I'm like, you guys have been doing NIL for years, and for them to be the one that is complaining really makes me laugh.
Yeah, I mean, everybody always complains about the tampering they say that's going on, and how NIL is making, affecting the competitive balance. But, as you touched on, in my opinion, there's not a whole lot of competitive balance in recruiting already anyway. Everyone knows the top 15, 20 schools that are going to get most of the 5-star and lots of 4-star guys. I personally don't think NIL has affected that in any way. I do think the coaches do have some valid arguments on, how easy it is for the players to move, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. If they're actually going to be treated as students, they have to be allowed to transfer kind of whenever they want. But it makes it hard to manage a roster when you don't know who's going to be on your team from year to year. So I get some of those complaints, and I think there are some ways that can be addressed as well. But it's gonna take talking with players and agreeing on rules that they've had a hand in making. And I don't think the NCAA is just going to be able to impose any, additional transfer restrictions on players. But you do see some of the federal laws kind of trying to address that as well. So we'll see what happens there.
Well, yeah, because college athletes now have greater authority over their own careers than pro athletes do. Pro athletes have contracts, at least. These guys can move at will, and it is really screwing programs up, in my opinion. You mentioned the coaches don't know who their teams are going to be year to year. You've got to re-recruit your own players year to year now. That, to me, I think that there has to be some kind of commitment from these players, whether it's a 2-year commitment, I don't care. It does not have to be 4, but I think that there has to be some kind of commitment because they're getting all the benefits now without any having to put out any strain.
Yeah, I do agree with you. If the players were able to enter in and the teams were able to enter into agreements, or contracts like they do in pro sports that says you'll be here for at least 2 years and here's the other terms of your agreement, I think that would be better for both sides. It just provides more certainty from the player side and from the team and the coach side. So I'm definitely in favor of that, and whether we'll get to that at some point where you see the athletes, as employees of the university or their team or some other entity, I do think that would make things a lot easier for everyone involved.
Well, and that's another thing I wanted to ask. Is it just a matter of time before they're employees, or there is profit sharing something? Because you have teams like Oklahoma football, and every scholarship player on Oklahoma's team is making $70,000 minimum. Every guy across the board. Then you've got a team like, say, Indiana. They don't have that. And that's their fault. They don't have that commitment to football, but they're going to have to in some form. Now they're getting some help now because the Big Ten is going to do away with divisions, and they're not going to have to play Penn State, Michigan State, and Ohio State every single year. So that helps a team like Indiana and Maryland and Rutgers. But also the money thing. They've got to get to a point to where they're sharing, to where it's more of an even playing field again.
Yeah, I do. On the employment issue, I do think we'll see that happen at some point in the relatively near future. There are a couple proceedings that are pending right now that are asking either a court or the National Labor Relations Board to find that at least certain athletes, we're talking mostly Power 5 football, Division I basketball, men's and women's, are employees of the university, their conferences, and or the NCAA. So I think that's definitely going to happen at some point. And then in terms of kind of what you're talking about with the revenue sharing, I mean, the way NIL is right now, the dollars are basically being funded by donors. And so that's, kind of all over the place, depending on whether your school, supports football, does it support basketball, or some other sport, kind of where the donors want to put their money. But I do agree with you that long term, it probably makes more sense to have, whether they're still called NIL dollars or it's just revenue sharing, that money coming directly from the schools or the conferences, because those are the entities that are receiving the big checks from the TV broadcast revenue. And that's probably the money that should be shared with the athletes. I don't think you should be relying long-term on donors to be funding the payments for the athletes, because like you said, that's kind of all over the place.
And then is every sport, every athlete in every sport going to get paid? Because that's, to me now, you're borderline ridiculous, because football pays maybe with basketball, but it pays for every other sport at a school. So why should these sports be paying these athletes?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think we'll see a world where every athlete is getting paid. Title IX makes things a little tricky, but if I were able to snap my fingers and we could create a new model for college athletics, as you mentioned, football and in a lot of cases men's basketball, especially if you take into account the NCAA's tournament contract, which is about $1 billion a year. Those athletes, in my opinion, deserve more of that revenue. And the other sports that are reliant on that revenue, I think there are other ways to come up with funding models for those sports, whether it's from Olympic programs or wherever that funding is coming from. But I think kind of just the whole model needs to be reimagined to take into account a lot of those factors, because a lot of the pushback that there is to changing the model as well, football and to some extent basketball, are the ones funding all these other sports. And if we give more of that money to those athletes, then how are we going to pay for these other sports? But I think there are ways to do it.
Mitt, what is it that you guys do mostly for sports athletes?
So most of the stuff that I do in the NIL space, I represent some universities. I represent a lot of NIL collectives kind of all over the country. I represent a bunch of different NIL startup businesses doing different things in this space to take advantage of the changing rules. And I have represented some athletes as well. A lot of what I've done for athletes is helping them negotiate agreements with agents, which is important before a college athlete signs a deal with an agent, to have someone, at least review it for them and potentially help negotiate some of the terms. You can negotiate the commission rates and things like that. Is an agent going to take a commission from a collective? If they are, how much is it? What's the commission going to be on other deals they bring to you? So that's kind of where my focus has been in the NIL space.
What percentage of today's athlete would you say has an agent now?
It's still a very low percentage. Most of the athletes that have agents are, more your high profile football, basketball players. There's some other athletes in other sports that, may have a really big social media following, and so they can get a lot of NIL deals thrown at them, who have agents as well. If we're talking percentage, if we're talking all NCAA college athletes, I would say it's definitely in the single digits percentage and probably under 5%. It's still not a very big number. But if you're talking basketball, football at the P5 level, it's probably higher than that, but it's still not a majority of guys that have agents.
What's the biggest change you expect over the next year or so?
A lot of it's going to depend on what happens with a federal NIL law and what the NCAA is going to do with what they're calling their Plan B. But I think we'll continue to see some more NIL activities move in-house at universities. Kind of what you've seen down in Texas A&M. They're planning on moving a lot of their NIL activity into their athletics fundraising arm, which is a separate entity from the university. And some other universities are planning similar things. Depending on what happens with the federal law and the NCAA rules, I think we'll see more of that, just because the schools, they do want to provide more NIL resources to their athletes, and they kind of want to be more involved in the process as well. Some of them are still a little unsure of having these collectives, which are run by boosters, kind of being the ones in control of the NIL process, and they'd like to step in there a little bit more.